All right, sorry for the delay. My Discord decided to crash literally at the turn of the hour. So that was just fun times. So to start, let me give you a quick little joke. What do you call a wolf who is lost in the woods? A werewolf. Anyway, my name is Thurston Howell. Let me knee the desk real quick. My name is Thurston Howell. I am a furry editor. I work for Sinister Stoke Press, which is a furry horror press, as well as Thurston Howell Publications. And I also run a Telegram group called the Dead Furry Society. And I'll talk a little bit about what that is shortly. But my plan for this session, at least, is to again, talk about the Dead Furry Society, talk about the history of furry horror over the past 10 years, talk about some anthologies I've had come out, as well as talk about what makes furry horror unique. Talk about some anthologies coming up, and I'll even have some time for people to kind of workshop some horror ideas live in the chat. And then there'll be time for questions, of course. So let's dive right on in. And I have an eye on the chat, so if anyone needs to interrupt me for any questions or anything, by all means, go for it. I love discussions. So the Dead Furry Society is a Telegram group I started about 2 or 3 years ago. And it's basically just a bunch of furry horror writers and fans. And we're separated into two different groups, a general chat and a writing chat. And a lot of what we do is we have fairly regular, maybe 3 or 4 times a year, workshops, usually specifically tailored to different anthologies. So whenever there are furry horror anthologies coming out, I say, hey, let's take a couple weeks and workshop ideas off each other and give each other feedback and possibly even have a first draft by the end of this workshop series. This year, we even had our first conference, which was a month-long series of panels, of readings, of workshops, exercises, write-ins. It was all kinds of fun stuff. And it was just focused on furry horror. And this year, we actually tried something different with the group, which was we had an anthology exclusive to the group, which is coming out hopefully early next year. We had Halloween 1 come out earlier this year, but I decided to do Halloween 2 exclusively through the Dead Furry Society. So that was kind of a fun time. And if anyone's interested in joining it, you can just message me at Thurston Howell on Telegram, and I can add you. Not a problem. So it's a fun little group. We talk about all kinds of creepy stuff, and we're excited for Halloween. So I kind of want to talk a little bit about the history of furry horror, like where that comes from, what major works there have been over the past few years, and to kind of show a little bit of a trajectory there. So to start, I'm just going to show some of my favorite furry horror books, or not even favorites, just some major ones I can think of, besides ones that I've done specifically. And some of these inspired me to get into furry horror. So I'm going to start with one of my all-time favorites, which is The Goat. This is by Bill Kiefer, released by Weasel Press, and I think rebranded as Sinister Stoke Press. And it's a major transformation horror book focusing on the world of Bill Kiefer. I can't recommend the book enough. I think I'm literally actually a reviewer on the back cover. I loved it so much. And yeah, I've loved working with Bill Kiefer ever since. He kind of got me into erotic horror as a genre. Another one that Sinister Stoke did is a book called Dread, which is this kind of furry stories based on the No Sleep subreddit or something like that. So it's all a bunch of creepy furry horror stories. And I think they're actually coming out with a volume 2 soon as well, I believe. Another one that you have to always go back to is Fang Volume 2, which is kind of a Halloween version of um, just erotic stories, and that's really fun seeing that play out. I actually would also recommend the Trick or Treat volumes, but I don't actually have any of those on my shelf, believe it or not. I'd also recommend, of course, Jocko Milan's Rewritten, which loved this book. It's a very gritty horror story, which we don't get a lot of. I also recently reviewed Tarl Hawk's Bleak Horizons, which is a sci-fi horror anthology, and it's just a good old time. And finally, a more recent one is Joe Sherman's The Student. It is an interesting one. I guess you could call it erotic horror, but it is an example of furry horror that's come out recently. All the same, I think it's coming up on volume 3 for that author now. I think the first 2 volumes were nominated for Leos, but I don't think either won one actually. And that does bring me to some of the ones I've done as well. Because I read a lot of these furry horror books and was like, I have to make some now. We need more of this. So one of them I have to like cover out the character's ass as Twitch. But this is Slashers, which was a book of furry slasher stories. And it was such a blast doing this one. Oh, one second. Thank you. I have coffee now. I'm set. Yeah, Slashers was a really fun project to work on. It was cool giving authors this challenge of, hey, write a furry slasher. And they really rose to the challenge on that one. Yeah, Arcane Reno, he's in this one. There are a lot of big authors in it. And there's a meta narrative in the book where each author is a character sitting at a campfire telling these stories, while each author is actually being picked off one by one by an unknown slasher. So that was a lot of fun for me to write as well, was that meta narrative. Next is, I think, my first furry horror book, which was Seven Deadly Sins, which I would argue is kind of my intro to anthology editing, really. That was my first major book. And it's also one of my biggest. I mean, it's humongous. And that kind of also did the same meta narrative and asked writers to pick a specific deadly sin and write a horror story based on that. So that got pretty fun pretty quick. And the last one I have, at least handy, is Inferno, which is similar to Seven Deadly Sins, but instead of having authors focus on a sin, they had to focus on a specific circle of hell. So that was fun. Zarp says that was the first anthology they wrote for, which is awesome. I was so glad to have so many authors have like their first story come out in Seven Deadly Sins. That was such a blast. And both of them were actually illustrated by Joseph Cho, who's an amazing artist, and I've loved working with him as a horror artist. And I think kind of out of my love of the furry horror anthology, I kind of rebranded an imprint of Thurston Hall Publications furry publications as Bound Tales, which is this triple entendre of kink, of horror, and a furry. So I love seeing the new titles that are coming out of Bound Tales under Cedric's direction, which is awesome. So a lot of people often ask me what makes furry horror unique, especially when we look at the old discourses in furry literature of it has to really, you can't replace it with human characters in it work because it's not really furry. That old discourse comes up a lot with horror as well. Like what makes this a unique horror story that couldn't be told if it was humans? And there's a lot to be said for that. And I see it a lot in the authors I've worked with, in slashers, in the haunted den, all that kind of stuff. And some of the major tropes I see, like the obvious one that most of you could probably think of off the cuff, would be feral, transformation, that kind of stuff. The basic premise of Zootopia taken to the horror context. A person turns into their were self, their more primitive self, or they become rabid, is the basic premise of those kind of stories. And I see a lot of those. That's a fairly common type of story throughout the furry horror anthologies. I see that one a lot. Um, and it's fun. It's fun to work with. It's a very easy go-to for someone who's not well versed in furry horror. That's a very easy go-to. Um, I think I remember Al Song doing one story like that recently. I want to say that was for Halloween. He played with a good transformation feral play story. Um, Another good case is a focus on fur, especially in more splatterpunk genres of furry horror. It's very fascinating seeing the ways that fur can be mangy, it could be for torture scenes, it can be pulled, it can be removed through painful means. I know this is going to be a torture workshop, but that works. Yeah, splatterpunk works really well when we think about fur and what can happen to fur, like singed fur and things like that. So fur really worked for a lot of gore aesthetics when it comes to furry horror. Um, Another one that's really easy is a focus on species. Um, some species work really well for horror. I mean, of course, the obvious case is um, the wolf, the werewolf. But I know Tarlhawk wrote no, I think I can curse. I think this is a soft 18 plus panel. So it was a fucking amazing short story for sensory details, uh, in which he focused on a spider, and it was erotic horror. And I was just so amazed with how he made the spider, which is already very terrifying for a lot of people, even more terrifying in that story. And that was just beautifully done. Um, so there are a lot of species that just naturally lend themselves to this horror aesthetic. And a lot of them can even be worked as very uncanny. Um, like I'd love to see a Slender Man recast as a maned wolf, you know? I mean, Furry Writers Guild, we love our leggy memes. So it'd be super cool to see that as the Slender Man, or even the what's the newest one? Siren Head cast as the main wolf or something. There's just so many opportunities for species to be uncanny naturally. Um, so that's always room for thought right there. And another one of my favorite ways of making furry horror unique is through sensory details. People who know me in the Dead Furry Society will talk all day long about how I bitch at them night and day about making sensory details matter. Um, because the way I see it is you're dealing with characters who have animal traits. And very often that means they'd have heightened hearing or heightened sight. So when we think about horror, that translates in very natural ways. Suddenly, a character will hear breathing around the corner. So the suspense is dismantled a little bit. So I'm curious to see how a furry writer navigates that when the character has heightened hearing, or they can see in the dark better than we humans can. So, how does that work out? So I'm super invested in the ways that furry writers tackle sensory details in horror. That's such a powerful challenge that when writers rise to meet that challenge, I see they've gone above and beyond to really make the horror so much more palpable, so much more. Um, so yeah, I just love the use of sensory details. I mean, I edited the book Sensory Details because of that specific challenge in mind. So yeah, I love that. Now, I did want to also bring up kind of some upcoming anthologies because I've kind of talked about past books, I've talked about ways to write furry horror. So I kind of want to also talk about um, some books that are coming up that I would love people to submit to because there's just so much room for more stories to be submitted to those places. The first is The Howling Dead, edited by Cedric Bacon, and that's on our Thurston Howell Publications website. If I remember the link, it's thurstonhowellpublications.com/bound-tales, Tales. And you can find the call there. But the basic idea for The Howling Dead is furry zombies. That's the whole premise, furry zombies. And I'm really excited to see what kind of anthology Cedric puts together with that, just because um, it hasn't been tackled often enough. I think I saw some zombie stories in Fang too, but it's really not something um, that happens a whole lot. Uh, and actually, you know what? I can probably post that link in the chat real quick too, because it was just asked about. There you go. So that's where some of the anthologies are. Um, yeah, Howling Dead should be a real blast. Just thinking about zombie and like we we always think about zombies as putrefied human flesh, decaying human flesh. So, what happens more to animals? What happens to fur? What happens to snouts, to tails? And of course, that brings up the other obvious trope: what happens to roadkill? That'd be a fun furry story right there. The next anthology is Electric Sewer 2, which is one I'm editing, and it's on the same link actually. And the Electric Sewer is a very, very, very adult anthology. So risque that I had two people who were accepted to the anthology who actually wanted it pulled after they were accepted because it was too dark for them. So Electric Sewer goes above and beyond in terms of its vulgarity. It's a predominantly erotic horror anthology, so it's invested in the ways that sex mingles with horror in exponentially horrifying ways in a single setting, a nightclub called the Electric Sewer. And the world building details are listed in the call. It's not a whole lot of info because I like to give people room to make the world what they want to. But there are some limits to it, and that's on the call. Um, but it's a fun time. I loved working on the first one. The first one had black pages, different colored neon text, had bar recipes for drinks based on each story, as well as a playlist curated by the authors for what the club's playset was. So it was a fun time. And the last one is actually an announcement. I talked with my fiance Weasel, and we are coming up with a new furry horror anthology series. It's not going to be themed like Howling Dead or Electric Sewer. It's just going to be open call furry horror, and it's going to be an annual anthology. And in the naming mode of Roar, Fang, Dread, Claw, all of those, this one is called Beast. So we're going to have Beast Volume 1. And I believe we just finalized the submission call, so I think that's going to be posted pretty soon. But yeah, you can definitely check the Weasel Press submittable, which I believe would just be weaselpress.submittable.com, question mark. If I remember how submittable links work. And it'll be uploaded there, like, might have been earlier, might be in the next hour or so. But yeah, we're going to have Beast Volume 1 coming out soon, which is exciting. So yeah, I actually wanted to open up maybe a good 10 to 20 minutes to kind of do. I was planning on separating story pitch time from Q&A time, but realistically, I'm fine with either. So we can open up the rest of the time for people to say, hey, here's a story idea for Electric Sewer, or here's a story idea for Beast I'd like to pitch to you. Or if you have questions about furry horror, we have a lot of time. I wanted to have like 30, 40 minutes to just focus on pitches and Q&A. So as the old song goes, hit me with your best shot. I am prepared. Okay, Al Song says Friday the 13th set in Candyland. That'd be a blast. I'd have fun with that. It'd have a lot of dark Wizard of Oz feels, and I'm here for it. Plus, furries love their colors, so it's like a colorful version of a slasher just sounds like a hell of a good time. I see the question for people getting into furry horror or horror in general, what would be a good place to start? So I'm going to repeat the old adage that you have to read to write. So I'd easily recommend thinking about some of the horror books that I mentioned already and try getting a couple. If I had to recommend two as a starting place, I'd probably say Slashers and The Haunted Den, just because they're so varied in the type of horror that they are. And they go from soft horror to very intense horror. So that's a good place to start, is reading some books. Um, and especially if you're thinking about submitting to a specific call, make sure you read the call very thoroughly and make sure you know what you're getting into. And I know, at least for Cedric and I, we're always open for people to email us, telegram us, and say, hey, I have a story idea. Could you tell me what you think of it? And that's always okay. I see the question, how do you feel about having both furries and humans in a horror story? Totally okay. I think that yields very interesting possibilities between the obvious possibility of were horror or transformation. It yields naturally to that kind of narrative. So I'm always okay with both. And yeah, with the reading, I'd recommend Slashers and Haunted Den. Absolutely. Would your house or you as editor accept furry adjacent work like werewolves and like? Absolutely. It is not something that I see a lot of actually. Um, yeah, I totally accept furry adjacent work. Absolutely. What are some tropes you'd like to see go out of style in the genre? Ooh, that's a good question. Um, so I guess even though I just said I accept transformation, feral, and wear stories, I'd like to see that kind of uh, fade out a little bit. Or let me rephrase that. I'd like to see it made more unique. Because once in a blue moon, pun intended, I will get a story that's literally just a very basic person transforms into werewolf, goes on a killing spree, is killed. It's like this is literally no different than Victorian werewolf stories. Um, so if you're going to give me a transformation story, make it unique. Um, but other than that, there aren't many furry horror tropes that are overdone at this point. So that'd kind of be my spiel there. I see the note. You have to watch out for problematic tropes in mixed human furry stories, such as no speciesism stand in for racism. Absolutely. I know that's often tough for some writers. I've written a few book reviews over the past 2 years that have addressed that very idea. Um, so it's just something to be mindful of. And for tips on that, I definitely recommend checking out Weasel's diversity panel tomorrow too. Dirk Coyote says, with furry horror in mind, what genres of horror do you see overplayed and which ones need more attention? So, again, I see transformation as the dominant one that's submitted to me. That's the dominant one. Or the idea of someone turning feral. That's the overplayed one often. Which ones need more attention? I would say I'd like to see, first of all, more erotic horror. I know that's something I publish a lot of, but I know for a lot of the writers doing it, it's a first for them. This is really the first time they've ever even thought to mix the two together, erotica and horror. So I would like to see even more of that, even though that's what I'm currently publishing the most of. I'd like to see um, people look more at classic horror films, between the Universal horror films to the Hammer ones to the movie monsters of the 50s. I'd like to see that kind of stuff play out more. How about inverting or deconstructing of tropes? Absolutely. Um, I've had so many good stories over the past few years where a person takes a horror trope and flips it on its head. And it is always lovely when I get to see that happen. It's such a blast. Um, I think I had that a lot with the Haunted Den, actually. It was a lot of flipped tropes happening, and that was such a blast. Um, I've seen slashers flipped on their heads. I've seen the ghost stories flipped on their heads. I've seen the trope of the final girl flipped on its head. Um, so many tropes inverted, and it's so much fun when I get to see that happen. Uh, Scribbles asks, "How do you feel about self-aware horror?" I don't get that often, but I've seen it, and it's fun when it does happen. Um, I want to say there was one I got from Cedric. There was a slasher story that was really fun. That was self-aware. I think one from Kirisis or Kiri did that also in the slashers book, I think. Um, so yeah, there's a lot of room for self-aware horror, and it's really fun when it happens. When did furry horror start happening? I think in my stack of books, I think Fang 2 is the oldest. I think so. So I think that'd be the oldest, at least in terms of anthology, that I could find. I mean, you can go back further. You could go back to, the paperback George Wells' Taurus, which is an erotic horror about minotaurs. Um, So, I mean, you could go back if you want to do that, but if you're treating furry fandom, furry community produced horror, except for maybe like the occasional Halloween con book or something, I think the first major one I know of is Fang 2. Uh, Bruno says, any suggestions for how to use the animal traits for a horror story? Or any suggestions on how to make sure animal senses won't take away from the horror? Well, um, I kind of view it in the inverse. Rather than thinking about how animal senses can take away, try to think of ways that animal senses can amplify, such as usually animal night vision is still in a more limited spectrum of colors. It's not just because when we say they have night vision, we don't mean that they actually can see full color like they could in the daytime. Um, so it's like suddenly the ambiance for your story could turn to a kind of grayscale or a kind of limited sight in terms of distance. So already that becomes uh, a visual ambiance already. Um, Likewise with sound, you hear leaves crunching a whole lot more. Um, that means you need to describe the environment in richer terms as opposed to more minimal. So for me, at least, when thinking about that kind of stuff, it's more of the senses help create an ambiance that's already chilling and terrifying. That it doesn't take away from the horror; it actually adds to it. Next question I'm seeing is, how do you stop furry horror erotica from devolving into masturbatory material for blood, gore, and violence? Or is that the point? That is a very good question. So, erotic horror, as a premise, first of all, let me say it's not for everyone. So, when I explain this, don't think to yourself, well, I disagree with this, therefore it's not valid. it's something that works for a lot of people, but not for others in the same vein. So erotic horror is not the same as saying it's horror that happens to have sex in it, or vice versa. It's not sex that happens to have horror in it. Rather, it's the idea that it's a story that, in the same moment, it's trying to arouse you, it's trying to horrify you in the exact same breath. It makes you feel ashamed or uncomfortable for your erotic response to the story. Um, the person who's never read erotic horror goes, oh, so it's just castration. And that's not the case at all. Rather, erotic horror is more invested in, let's say, a sex scene devolving into a blood ritual to summon a demon, or perhaps a slasher who beguiles his victims sexually first, creating a kind of dubcon scenario. So, content warning, erotic horror often does deal with dubious consent very often, because it's invested in this idea that sex can be very fluid and sex expression can be fluid. So it's very invested in the ways that the body can be problematized and complicated when blood is introduced and penetration is introduced in multiple ways. So it can be really fun on a creative standpoint, but for some people, it is not their cup of coffee. So is blood, gore, and violence the point? Often, and that's okay. The follow-up question is, do you have trouble publishing furry horror erotica with traditional publishers for those reasons? I'm going to say hell no. I mean, at least, granted, it's hard to say because I've helped run a furry horror publisher. I was the head of Bound Tales for a while. And we published a lot of furry horror erotica. I encouraged it from people. I had anthologies specifically for that call. I also, surprisingly, got away with a erotic ghost story in, I think it was Fang 10 or Fang 9. And that was accepted. And it was a sexual ghost story around HIV. And it worked somehow. And I've gotten similar stuff published in Armored Fox Press with a Swordmasters story that had a minotaur, literally, I mean, content warning, gore and sexual violence, literally skull fucking a person. It's very, like as in fucking like an eye socket, I think. So it's like really intense stuff that's getting published by these, the larger furry publishers even. So I'd say furry publishers the envelope is opening. It's being pushed. So go for it, or at least ask the editor if that's okay first, And yeah, Arcane Reno did play with that in the Halloween story, absolutely. That was fun. So yeah, fun stuff. And I'm sorry if it seems like there's a delay in me answering questions. I think the Twitch video is behind. So it's like I wait here and then like a million minutes later, I see the questions actually. Yeah, I figured you meant the dubcon, not the skull fucking. Yeah, I'm sorry about the lag. I wish I could magic it away. I'm sorry, TJ. So sorry. It's okay, Resolute. It's not your fault. It's just technology. That's a thing. But I mean, really, it's like when I first came into this fandom, coming into the furry writing community, there really wasn't a market for furry horror. Like there was no market whatsoever. Um, the closest we got was Trick or Treat, and even that's not. A lot of it isn't really horror. A lot of it's Halloween aesthetic stuff. I don't think it was super encouraging of erotic horror as a concept. Um, so when I came into it, I saw this very niche market could that I could work on, and I've loved seeing the Dead Furry Society come out. I've loved seeing all these books come out, and people are submitting like crazy, and it's a blast. I see. Did you start off writing horror stories? Um, no, actually. I started out writing fantasy stories, and then I kind of went into this um, sci-fi phase for a little bit. It was bad. I remember when I first got into furry writing, I had a few stories that all got rejected because I was just a bad writer and didn't read anything, or didn't read anything furry. I remember I wrote one story before having read a single furry book, and the editor of it said I was literally writing Kyle Gold fan fiction. And my response was, "Who is Kyle Gold?" So that was a funny moment because I just never even heard of the guy. Um, but I didn't start off writing horror. I started writing it actually right after I read Bill Kiefer's The Goat because it made me so uncomfortable. I had to literally shower for like an hour after reading it because I had never known erotic horror was even a concept that existed. Um, and it was so uncomfortable for me. And I remember after I calmed down after like a week, I was like, I want to make other people feel the way I felt. I want that kind of power over language to instill that same sense of dread and discomfort in others. Um, so I wanted to have a market for people like Bill Kiefer. I wanted to have that kind of opportunity for others to write the same kind of stuff. And I started writing it myself as a result. Um, and actually, it's been pretty cool because I've gotten like recognition for my horror writing outside furry circles as well, which has been fun. Um, there's also the question on horror: how does it sell compared to other genres? Then, if the market is newer, believe it or not, well, at least as in terms of Thurston Howe publications, I would say our biggest sales in terms of anthologies, which don't sell anyway. Our biggest sales have been the Furries Among Us essay collections, and then all of our horror books. So some of our non horror anthologies just don't sell, not a single bit. Um, Furry Cookbook doesn't do much. What the Fox doesn't do much. But you better believe Slashers and Seven Deadly Sins and Inferno, they all sell. In terms of anthology sales and what that actually means. It's like I'm comparing like 20 sales a year as opposed to 5, you know. It's take that as you will. I've heard it said that horror shares one big trait with humor, that they both induce physical sensations in the reader or listener that are felt in the body. Absolutely. My personal gauge is I'll make my fiance Weasel read a story I write. And if he's not disgusted by it and uncomfortable and very like, why would you do this? Why would you do this to this character? Then I didn't do a good job. So that's kind of my personal gauge for that. It's like at the moment there's no more questions or comments, but it's like I can see myself just now taking a drink of coffee that I took like 3 minutes ago. So it's taken its time. So I'm sorry that it seems like I'm just ignoring what you're saying. Scribble says horror and comedy go really well together, to be honest. But I am curious if there is a way to do it correctly where neither feels forced to be more prevalent than the other. I've seen some interesting horror comedies, and you're right that there's a balance that's tough to nail. I know I've often read things that are supposed to be like you look up Wikipedia and it's like this is satirical horror, and I'm like I had no idea it was horror, no idea whatsoever, and no idea it was comedy. So it's like that's a very tough balance to nail, even for someone like me I mean, who does horror all the time. It's not easy. What story has surprised you the most is the next question. Ooh, that's a good one. Um, hmm. Well, I have to say the goat, just because that initial shock of not knowing erotic horror even existed. Another one was Weasel's story in Slashers, which was a very gory story and made me very uncomfortable because for me, even though I do a lot of dubcon in erotic horror, one thing that upsets me is when I feel like there's this sense of individual justice, like a lot of revenge narratives and stuff like that. That kind of stuff makes me uncomfortable. Because even in my erotic horror, I put it in a way that, like, the character just maybe, might have deserved it. But in his story in Slashers, that was out the window. It was all just personal vendettas. And that bothered the piss out of me. I loved it, but it made me so uncomfortable. Um, TJ asked, would I say Inhuman X might be partially horror or is noir just graphic? I would not call Inhuman X horror. I've read it. And even, I mean, you got to realize, TJ, I'm coming at this from the world of erotic horror. So, like, for me, Inhuman X is not really that graphic. For me, Inhuman X is very soft. And if we're going to call it horror, it's very soft horror. Um, so it just wasn't that graphic for me. But do we want to call graphicness the sole limiting characteristic of horror? Probably not. Does it have potential for horror elements all the same? I think you could argue there are some stories in Inhuman Acts which might be horror esque. I could see it. There are some that do like a chilling aesthetic. I'll give you that. Yeah, that's a good link, Tanver. I've seen that one before. It's a good link. There's horror comedy and horror romance erotica. What other genres do you think would work well when mixed with horror? Oh, there are so many. Horror sci-fi, if you want to look at Tarhawk's Bleak Horizons. Um, I'd like to see horror noir. I know Miles Reaver has done that very well. Um, I'd like to see fantasy horror. I think I've seen Cedric do that one time, and I had to really make him edit that one because I really wanted him to pull out that fantasy some more. Um, I've seen mystery horror work with Ian Keller in Slashers. That was fun. So yeah, those are good ones. Voice says two writing suggestions. There's a lot of chat all of a sudden, which is awesome. Ramsey Campbell, Scared Stiff. I love Ramsey Campbell. He's great. Clive Barker's Books of Blood. I'm actually teaching that in class this semester, which is fun. Love Books of Blood. Can't recommend it enough. Did I miss another one? Yeah, I figured you meant reading. Sci-fi horror is a great combo, absolutely. Fuzz says it's a soft boy. I'm not sure what that was in reference to because of the lag and stuff. What's been my favorite description that hasn't been visual? Cool use of other senses. Oh, such a good question, and I love dealing with that. I have to go with voice. I can't recommend this one story enough, but like, Voice had a horror story, an erotic horror story, and sensory details that focuses so much on texture, on the feeling of sense. It's like a spider's sense of vibrations through webs, and a character who is essentially blindfolded and made to feel both horror and eroticism through feeling alone. And that was just so artfully done. I can't recommend that enough in terms of sense based horror. I can't recommend it enough. Um, Fantasy horror isn't done very often, agreed. Iggy says, I was running into that problem with balance when writing a project this year. Tried to do a horror satire and didn't feel that I was well enough acquainted with horror genre to write it successfully. So time for me to read more horror. Yeah, you can never read enough though. I mean, have some good samples to go off of and try your best from there and trust that an editor will help you with the rest. Arcane adds at least not traditional fantasy. Agreed. Yeah, there's a lot of urban fantasy horror, but not traditional fantasy horror. I'd like to see more evil, demonic dragons and stuff for sure. Scribbles adds House of Hairs is one of my favorite short stories. Yes, Ian nailed that story. That was such a blast. Another good podcast reference. Another good, yeah, sword and sorcery subgenre does overlap with Lovecraft mythos. It can, yeah, I've seen it. Oh yeah, voice. I will always praise you for that. Yes, yes, yes. There's so many good stories. It's hard to remember all the good stories I've read just in the horror circles. It's like I seriously recommend, like, I'm actually gonna post this in the chat. And you'll get it in chat before you see I even mention it in video, knowing how this is. But I'm just posting my Telegram info if you want access to Dead Furry Society. And speaking of horror, I'm actually wearing my Friday the 13th jersey right now, which is fun. Outside of Furry, what are some recommendations for horror books? Oh, you're talking to the person who has 500, 600 horror books. Let me give you a good list here. Because I focus a lot on diverse horror. So I'm going to post a list in the chat. Guild of Stories by Joel Gomez. I'd say Fledgling by Octavia Butler. Mongrels, POC Werewolf by Stephen Graham Jones. What else do I usually like? Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter. What else is usually on my list? Oh, Shiver by Junji Ito, of course. Oh, Let's Play White by Cheshire Burke. I think that's a good list. I'm glad you like the background. This is it's actually not a digital background. It's a textured, like an actual screen behind me. Tommy, I got to pick 5. I just not even saw that. I think I picked 5 or 6. Let's see. I only read the Deathless series by Graveyard Greg. Yeah, Graveyard Greg is really good. Oh, hells yeah, I got exactly 5. Yeah. I just realized I have 2 coffee cups full of coffee. Yeah, everything by Octavia Butler is a blast. Oh, and I have to recommend a 6th one. One more. Hopefully, Dirk Howard, you won't kill me for going over 5. Well, I know it's 6:55, so I have about 5 minutes left. So I guess if you have any final questions, just let me know. Um, Otherwise, just feel free to message me on Telegram at Thurston Howell because I love, love, love chatting about horror and furry horror. I mean, seriously, if I am the most excitable person, if you message me just randomly and go, "Hey, I have a story idea. Will you listen to it?" So yeah. Scribble says, "I remember when I was writing my story for slashers, you sent me one of your stories, Five Nights with Teddy, as a reference for sensory details. Yeah, that was a fun story too. I wrote that in the anthology Burnt Fur, which is also a killer anthology and can't recommend that one enough either. Um, what genres don't work with horror? I don't think there is such a thing. I think any genre can work with if you make it. Magio says, ever found yourself getting horror vibes from something that wasn't meant to be horror? I'm sure I did before I got into horror hardcore, but it's like now that I'm so far down the rabbit hole, it's like it's hard for me to find horror stories, real horror nowadays. It's I go too far the opposite direction now. Uh, yes, girls, that was a dark story on my end. It was very, very dark, very fucked up. A blast to write. I was very glad it got accepted, and that it's in this phenomenal book with a lot of phenomenal authors. Well, I'm totally excited for the second term. Cooking horror. Well, that's actually there are a couple of horror stories in the furry cookbook. So believe it or not, it exists. Tanfer says, I keep finding myself writing a story and anticipatory and turns out not to be horror. Any suggestions? I would easily recommend. Um, I mean, for starters, I recommend reading. Definitely read Clive Barker's Books of Blood, if only the story Dread, because that's a very powerful story. Because it's hard to really get that sense of don't just throw gore in there. That doesn't make a horror story. You have to actually create this building sense of dread to make it really work. Do I ever write anything too horrific for me? Even for me? Absolutely. I make myself uncomfortable in my stories all the time. I'm like, if this were ever a film, I couldn't watch it. It'd be too much for me. Horror film or show recommendations? Oh, that's a tough one. I mean, I love Jordan Peele. So, I mean, Get Out is a great film. I definitely enjoyed Hush. I mean, it has some problematic elements to it, but Hush is an okay film. Um, it's okay. Um, I've loved watching Blackula this year. That was a blast. Um, what else? I like a lot of old horror at the moment. Um, like I'm doing a huge horror film marathon from the 1890s up to the present day, and it's like a 800 film list, and I'm up to 1973, I think. So it's taken a while. Not a fan of Poe. Overrated. I'll be that guy, that person. I'm going to misgender myself here. All right. Well, thank you everyone so much for doing this panel. I'm going to hop off, but thank you so much.